If you grew up in the 1980s, science fiction wasn't just something you watched, it was something you imagined. The decade gave us giant blockbuster franchises like Star Wars, Back to the Future, Aliens, and Star Trek. But beyond the movies everyone remembers was another world of science fiction, a world filled with killer robots, alien visitors, nuclear apocalypse, artificial intelligence, media manipulation, and futures that looked both exciting and terrifying. Some of these stories arrived in movie theaters, others appeared as television events and miniseries that millions of people watched and then slowly forgot. Yet many of them explored ideas that are more relevant today than ever before. Long before social media, there was Looker. Before smart homes and consumer robotics, there was Runaway. Before endless discussions about nuclear war and global instability, there were Threads and The Day After. These stories imagined futures that seemed impossible at the time, but today feel surprisingly familiar. In this video, we're taking a trip back to the 1980s to revisit 10 science fiction movies and television productions that deserve to be remembered. Some were hits, some disappeared almost immediately, but all of them offered a glimpse into the future as people imagined it more than 40 years ago. So grab your popcorn, fire up the VCR, and let's revisit 10 forgotten science fiction films and miniseries from the 1980s. Before robot vacuum cleaners, smart homes, and AI assistants became part of everyday life, there was Runaway. Released in 1984 and starring Tom Selleck, Runaway imagined a future where robots had become common household tools. They cooked, cleaned, maintained homes, and helped make everyday life easier. But when one of these machines malfunctioned, a special police unit known as the Runaway Squad was called in to investigate. Selleck plays Sergeant Jack Ramsey, a veteran officer responsible for tracking down dangerous robots. What begins as a series of routine incidents soon evolves into a larger conspiracy involving weapons, technology, and a criminal mastermind played by Gene Simmons of the band Kiss. Looking back, what's remarkable about Runaway isn't the story itself, it's how many of its ideas feel surprisingly familiar today. The film predicted a world filled with consumer robotics, computerized homes, drone-like machines, and technology integrated into everyday life. In 1984, those concepts seemed futuristic. Today, many of them are reality. One of the film's most memorable moments involves small robotic spiders designed as weapons. While the special effects may look dated by modern standards, the underlying idea of autonomous machines being used for harmful purposes feels more relevant now than ever. Unfortunately, Runaway was released during a decade packed with science fiction classics. Movies like The Terminator, Aliens, and Back to the Future dominated the conversation, leaving Runaway largely forgotten by mainstream audiences. But for fans of 1980s science fiction, it's a fascinating look at how filmmakers imagined the future of robotics long before most of us carried computers in our pockets. Runaway may not be remembered alongside the biggest science fiction films of the decade, but it remains one of the most interesting techno-thrillers of the 1980s, and a reminder that sometimes the future arrives faster than we expect. Long before social media influencers, digital avatars, deepfakes, and virtual celebrities became a reality, there was Looker. Released in 1981 and written and directed by Michael Crichton, Looker follows Dr. Larry Roberts, a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon played by Albert Finney. When several of his patients, successful fashion models, begin dying under mysterious circumstances, he uncovers a conspiracy involving a powerful technology company known as Digital Matrix. At the center of the mystery is a groundbreaking technology capable of digitally scanning and recreating a person's appearance. Once someone's image is captured, that digital version can be used indefinitely, eliminating the need for the real person altogether. For audiences in 1981, the idea sounded like pure science fiction. Today, it feels almost prophetic. Looker predicted a future where digital representations could replace real people in advertising, entertainment, and media. The film explored concepts that would eventually become computer-generated imagery, virtual influencers, digital models, and even deep-fake technology decades before those terms entered the public vocabulary. The movie also introduced another fascinating idea, a device capable of briefly hypnotizing people through intense visual stimulation. While that technology remains fictional, the film's broader warnings about media influence and image manipulation feel surprisingly modern. Like many science fiction films of the era, Looker arrived before the world was ready for its ideas. Audiences were more interested in spaceships, spaceships, aliens, and action heroes than a thriller about digital identity and computer-generated celebrities. Over time, the film faded into obscurity, yet viewed today, Looker may be one of the most forward-thinking science fiction films of the entire decade. In an age where artificial intelligence can generate realistic images, videos, and even virtual personalities, many of the questions raised by Looker have become reality. Who owns a person's likeness? Can technology replace human performers? And how do we know what we're seeing is real? More than 40 years after its release, Looker remains a fascinating glimpse into a future that turned out to be much closer than anyone imagined. Released in 1985, Enemy Mine is one of the most thoughtful and underrated science fiction films of the decade. Starring Dennis Quaid and Louis Gossett Jr., the film takes place during an interstellar war between humans and an alien race known as the Dracs. Both species view each other as enemies, and years of conflict have only reinforced their hatred and distrust. Everything changes when a human pilot and a Drac warrior become stranded together on a hostile alien world. Forced to survive in an environment that threatens them both, the two enemies slowly learn that they have more in common than they ever imagined. What begins as distrust gradually develops into respect, friendship, and ultimately a bond that transcends the war that brought them together. At first glance, Enemy Mine appears to be a science fiction adventure, but beneath the spaceships and alien makeup lies a story about prejudice, understanding, and the consequences of judging others based on fear and assumptions. The film asks a simple but powerful question: what happens when you finally get to know the person you've been taught to hate? Louis Gossett Jr.'s performance as Drac is particularly memorable. Through makeup, language, and mannerisms, he creates one of the most compelling alien characters ever seen in a science fiction film. Despite its strong themes and emotional story, Enemy Mine struggled at the box office. Released during a decade crowded with blockbuster science fiction films, it was overshadowed by flashier movies featuring bigger action sequences and special effects. Over time, however, the film has earned a loyal following among science fiction fans who appreciate its message and unique approach to storytelling. Looking back today, Enemy Mine feels surprisingly relevant. Its themes of empathy, cultural differences, understanding, and finding common ground remain just as meaningful now as they were in 1985. While many science fiction films focus on technology and spectacle, Enemy Mine focuses on humanity. Or perhaps more accurately, what makes all intelligent life relatable regardless of where it comes from. More than 40 years later, it's still one of the most heartfelt and thought-provoking science fiction films of the 1980s. In the early 1980s, few fears were greater than the possibility of nuclear war. Released in 1983, The Day After was a television event that attempted to answer a terrifying question: what would happen if a full-scale nuclear war broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union? Set primarily in Kansas and Missouri, the film follows a group of ordinary people as international tensions escalate towards a global nuclear conflict. Farmers, students, doctors, soldiers, and families go about their daily lives unaware that the world is moving towards catastrophe. When the missiles finally launch, The Day After transforms from a drama into one of the most unsettling depictions of nuclear war ever shown on television. Unlike many science fiction films of the era, there are no heroes saving the day and no last-minute solutions. The film focuses instead on the immediate destruction, the collapse of basic services, widespread panic, radiation exposure, and the long-term human consequences of nuclear conflict. What made the movie so powerful was its realism. Presented almost like a documentary, the film showed viewers what life might actually look like in the days and weeks following a nuclear exchange. Hospitals became overwhelmed, communications broke down, governments struggled to maintain order, and survivors faced an uncertain future. When The Day After premiered on American television, it became one of the most watched television events in history. Millions of viewers tuned in, and the film sparked national conversations about nuclear weapons, Cold War tensions, and the future of humanity. For many people who watched it in 1983, it wasn't just entertainment, it was an experience. The film left audiences shaken and helped bring discussions about nuclear war into living rooms across America. Today, The Day After serves as a reminder of a very specific period in history when the threat of global nuclear conflict seemed frighteningly real. While newer generations may not fully appreciate the anxiety of the Cold War, the film captures that fear in a way few productions ever have. More than 40 years later, The Day After remains one of the most important and unforgettable science fiction television events of the 1980s, not because of special effects or futuristic technology, but because it forced viewers to confront a future they desperately hoped would never come true. Before shows like X-Files brought paranormal investigations into the mainstream, there was Something Is Out There. Originally airing in 1988 as a television miniseries, the story begins with a series of brutal and unexplained murders that leave police searching for answers. What they don't realize is that the killings are connected to an extraterrestrial creature that has arrived on Earth. Detective Jack Breslin, played by Joe Cortez, finds himself investigating the strange case alongside Teyra, an alien visitor portrayed by Miriam Diabo. Together they discover that a deadly alien predator is hiding among the population and must be stopped before more lives are lost. Part science fiction, part detective story, and part horror thriller, Something Is Out There offered audiences something very different from the typical television fare of the late 1980s. What makes the miniseries interesting today is its blend of genres. It combines police procedural storytelling with alien technology, government secrecy, and a shape-shifting extraterrestrial threat. Looking back, it almost feels like a preview of the kind of storytelling that would later make shows such as The X-Files so successful. The production was popular enough to launch a short-lived television series, but over the years, both the miniseries and the follow-up show gradually faded from public memory. That's a shame, because Something Is Out There contains many of the elements science fiction fans love: mysterious murders, alien visitors, advanced technology, and a race against time to stop a deadly threat. While it may not enjoy the same recognition as V, Alien Nation, or other science fiction productions of the era, it remains an entertaining reminder of a time when television networks occasionally took big risks on ambitious science fiction stories. For viewers willing to revisit this forgotten miniseries, Something Is Out There offers a fascinating blend of suspense, mystery, in 1980s science fiction that still holds up surprisingly well today. What if first contact with an alien species didn't lead to war, but immigration? That's the question at the heart of Alien Nation, one of the most unique science fiction films of the 1980s. Released in 1988, the film takes place several years after a massive alien spacecraft arrives on Earth carrying a race of humanoid aliens known as the Newcomers. Rather than invading the planet, the Newcomers are integrated into human society and must learn how to live alongside their adopted neighbors. The story follows Los Angeles police detective Matthew Sykes, played by James Caan, who is reluctantly partnered with Sam Francisco, a newcomer detective portrayed by Mandy Patinkin. As the two investigate a dangerous criminal conspiracy, they must overcome cultural differences, prejudice, and mutual distrust. On the surface, Alien Nation is a buddy cop movie. Underneath, it's a science fiction story about immigration, assimilation, discrimination, and the challenges of bringing different cultures together. What made the film stand out was its decision to use aliens not as invaders or monsters, but as a mirror for human society. The newcomers looked different, came from a different world, and had unfamiliar customs, but they faced many of the same challenges real immigrants encounter when adapting to a new country. The film balanced serious social commentary with action, humor, and a compelling detective story. It asked viewers to consider how they would react if millions of newcomers suddenly appeared in their community and tried to build better lives for themselves and their families. Although Alien Nation was successful enough to inspire a television series and several television movies, it has largely faded from popular conversation over the years. That's unfortunate, because many of the themes explored by the film remain remarkably relevant today. Questions about identity, diversity, inclusion, citizenship, and acceptance continue to shape society, making Alien Nation feel surprisingly modern despite being nearly 40 years old. Unlike many science fiction films that focus on technology or space battles, Alien Nation focused on people. It used an extraordinary premise to tell a very human story about learning to trust and understand those who seem different from us. For that reason, Alien Nation remains one of the smartest and most thought-provoking science fiction films of the 1980s, and one that deserves to be rediscovered by a new generation of viewers. What if an alien came to Earth and immediately stole a Ferrari, robbed a bank, and started a citywide crime spree? That's the premise behind The Hidden, one of the most entertaining and overlooked science fiction thrillers of the 1980s. Released in 1987, the film begins with a series of seemingly random violent crimes committed by individuals with no prior history of criminal behavior. An FBI agent named Lloyd Gallagher, played by Kyle MacLachlan, arrives in Los Angeles to investigate. Teaming up with local detective Tom Beck, portrayed by Michael Nouri, Gallagher begins tracking an unusual suspect that seems impossible to identify. The reason is simple: the criminal they're hunting isn't human. It's a parasitic alien life form capable of moving from one host body to another. Whenever a body is damaged or killed, the creature simply abandons it and takes control of someone else. This gives The Hidden a unique twist on the traditional alien invasion story. Instead of giant spaceships or public attacks, the threat hides in plain sight. Anyone could be the alien's next host, which creates a constant sense of tension and paranoia throughout the film. What makes the movie especially enjoyable is its blend of genres. It's part science fiction, part action movie, part horror film, and part police procedural. One moment you're watching a detective investigation, and the next you're witnessing a high-speed chase involving stolen sports cars, automatic weapons, and an extraterrestrial fugitive with terrible impulse control. Looking back today, The Hidden feels like a cousin to films such as The Thing, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and even television shows like The X-Files. The idea that an alien could secretly move between people and remain hidden among the population remains just as compelling now as it was in 1987. Despite receiving strong reviews, the film arrived during a decade crowded with major science fiction releases and never achieved the same level of recognition as Predator, RoboCop, or the Terminator. Over time, however, it developed a loyal cult following among fans who appreciate its clever premise, fast pace, and memorable performances. Today, The Hidden stands as one of the best science fiction thrillers most people have never seen. It combines suspense, action, humor, and a genuinely creative concept into a package that still holds up remarkably well nearly 40 years later. If you're looking for forgotten 1980s science fiction with a great premise and plenty of excitement, The Hidden deserves a place near the top of the list. If The Day After showed audiences the horrors of nuclear war, Threads went even further. Produced by the BBC, the first broadcast in 1984, Threads is widely regarded as one of the most realistic and terrifying depictions of nuclear conflict ever put on screen. Set in Sheffield, England, the film follows several ordinary families as tensions between NATO and the Soviet Union steadily escalate towards a global nuclear exchange. At first, life continues as normal. People go to work, attend school, plan weddings, and worry about everyday problems. In the background, however, international events gradually push the world closer to disaster. Then the missiles launch. Unlike most science fiction productions, Threads is not interested in heroes, action sequences, or dramatic rescues. Instead, it focuses on what happens after the bombs fall. The film depicts the collapse of government, communications, healthcare, transportation, food distribution, education, and ultimately civilization itself. Survivors face starvation, disease, radiation exposure, and a world that seems to be moving backwards rather than forwards. What makes Threads so effective is its documentary-like presentation. Events unfold in a cold, matter-of-fact manner, making the story feel frighteningly plausible. Rather than sensationalizing the catastrophe, the film presents nuclear war as a chain of consequences that grows worse with every passing year. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Threads is that the story doesn't end when the explosions stop. The film follows the survivors for years afterward, showing how generations grow up in a devastated world where knowledge, infrastructure, and social order have largely disappeared. When it first aired, many viewers described the experience as deeply unsettling. Some considered it the most frightening television program they had ever seen. Unlike traditional science fiction, Threads felt less like fantasy and more like a warning. More than 40 years later, the film remains shockingly effective. Its themes of geopolitical tension, societal fragility, and the consequences of global conflict continue to resonate with modern audiences. While many science fiction stories imagine exciting futures filled with technological advancements, Threads imagines the exact opposite, a future where humanity loses everything it once took for granted. That is what makes it so unforgettable. For many viewers, Threads isn't just one of the greatest science fiction productions of the 1980s, it's one of the most terrifying ever made. What if the Cold War ended not with a nuclear exchange, but with the quiet surrender of a superpower? That was the unsettling premise behind America, one of the most ambitious television miniseries of the 1980s. Broadcast by ABC in 1987 and starring Chris Christopherson, America presents an alternate future in which the United States has been politically and economically weakened to the point that it falls under Soviet influence and control. Rather than depicting a traditional military invasion, the miniseries explores something potentially even more frightening: the gradual loss of freedom, independence, and national identity. Christopherson plays Devin Milford, a former political leader who returns to his hometown after years away and discovers that the country he once knew has fundamentally changed. Local governments have been reorganized, civil liberties have been restricted, and compliance has slowly replaced resistance. What makes America unique is its focus on ordinary people. Instead of concentrating on military battles or international leaders, the story examines how everyday everyday citizens respond when their freedoms are slowly taken away? Families are divided, communities are fractured, and individuals must decide whether to cooperate, remain silent, or resist. When the miniseries aired, the Cold War was still very much a reality. The Soviet Union remained America's primary rival, and fears about nuclear war, espionage, and global conflict were common. As a result, America generated enormous attention and controversy, becoming one of the most talked about television events of its time. Looking back today, what stands out most is how different it feels from most science fiction. There is no spaceships, robots, or aliens. Instead, the series uses an alternate history future to explore themes of government power, censorship, personal freedom, propaganda, and civic responsibility. Like The Day After and Threads, America reflected a very specific anxiety of the 1980s. While those productions focused on the fear of nuclear war, America focused on the fear of what might happen if democratic institutions gradually disappeared. Despite drawing huge audiences when it originally aired, the miniseries has largely faded from public memory. Many people who lived through the 1980s remember it vividly, but younger audiences have often never heard of it. That's unfortunate because America remains a fascinating time capsule of the Cold War era and a powerful example of how science fiction can examine political and social concerns through imagined futures. While many science fiction stories ask what technology will do to humanity, America asks a different question. What happens when people lose the freedoms they've always taken for granted? More than 30 years later, that question remains just as thought-provoking as it was in 1987. Not every science fiction story needs killer robots, alien invasions, or the threat of nuclear war. Sometimes all it takes is a few small flying machines with big hearts. Released in 1987, Batteries Not Included tells the story of a group of tenants struggling to save their apartment building from a ruthless developer determined to force them out. Led by Frank and Faye Riley, played by Hume Cronin and Jessica Tandy, the residents seem to have little hope of preserving the only home they've known. Then something extraordinary appears. A group of small intelligent flying robots arrives and begin helping the building's occupants in unexpected ways. What makes Batteries Not Included so memorable is its warmth. While many science fiction films of the 1980s focused on conflict, technology gone wrong, or dystopian futures, this film focused on community, friendship, and hope. The mysterious machines aren't invaders or weapons, they're helpers. The film blends science fiction, comedy, and drama into a story that feels more like a modern fairy tale than a traditional sci-fi adventure. At its heart, it is a story about ordinary people facing difficult circumstances and discovering help from the unlikeliest of places. Looking back today, the special effects remain surprisingly charming. The small robotic visitors were brought to life through practical effects and puppetry, giving them a unique personality that still resonates with audiences decades later. Despite featuring names such as Steven Spielberg as executive producer, Batteries Not Included is often overshadowed by larger science fiction films of the era. Movies like Back to the Future, Aliens, Predator, and RoboCop tend to dominate conversations about the 1980s science fiction, leaving this smaller and more heartfelt film largely forgotten. That's unfortunate because it represents a different side of 1980s science fiction. Rather than warning us about technology, it imagines a future where technology is compassionate and capable of bringing people together. More than 40 years later, Batteries Not Included remains a charming reminder that science fiction doesn't always have to be about saving the world. Sometimes it's about saving a neighborhood, and that's what makes it one of the most enduring and most overlooked science fiction films of the 1980s. And there you have it, 10 science fiction movies and television productions from the 1980s that time largely forgot. Some predicted the future with surprising accuracy, others reflected the fears of the Cold War, some explored artificial intelligence, robotics, alien life, and the dangers of technology, while others simply told stories that deserve to be remembered. What's fascinating is that many of these productions asked questions we are still asking today. How much technology should we trust? What happens when society becomes dependent on machines? How do we treat those who are different from us? And what kind of future are we really building? While films like Star Wars, The Terminator, and Back to the Future continue to dominate discussions about 1980s science fiction, there were dozens of other movies and miniseries exploring equally fascinating ideas. They may not have become blockbusters, but they left an impression on the people who watched them. Maybe you remember watching The Day After and being unable to stop thinking about it for weeks. Perhaps Alien Nation made you look at people differently. Maybe Looker or Runaway predicted a future that seemed impossible at the time, but now feels remarkably familiar. For me, that's what makes these forgotten stories worth revisiting. They remind us that the future never arrives exactly the way we expect. Sometimes it arrives sooner, sometimes it arrives differently. And sometimes it arrives looking suspiciously like a science fiction movie we haven't thought about in 40 years. So now I'd like to hear from you. What science fiction movie or television series from the 1980s do you think deserves another look? Is there a forgotten favorite that should have made this list? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this trip back to the future of the 1980s, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join me next time as we continue exploring movies and television and technology and stories that shape their lives. Until next time, keep looking toward the future and don't forget the past. Peace out.